Hey everybody, Warhamster Brady here, welcoming you to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report. Joining me today is my good friend, the host of the Untold History channel, Ron Partain. And also joining us is Mr. Constitution himself, Douglas V. Gibbs. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to be here.
Today, we are going to be jumping into the fourth episode of our review of the Confederate Constitution and comparing it to the U.S. Constitution. And as we've previewed previously, they basically copied the blueprint of the U.S. Constitution almost verbatim, and it's the few changes they made that really give you some insight into the main reasons for secession in the first place.
Well, the main reasons for secession, and also if they understood the original intent, and some of the clarifying language also gives us clues into what was originally intended with the document, the Constitution.
In the last episode, we went through Article 1, Section 8. Again, they basically just copied the blueprint and made some tweaks. And there were some improvements. And we've gone through it. Last week we completed. Go ahead, Ryan.
I think it's important. The one thing that we haven't really stated is that we're not just going through it. We're going through it line by line, comparing it line by line with the and that's one statement that we haven't actually made. We're going through it, yes, but we're actually going through it line by line. Which is which is important because we're going through it in very great detail.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because words matter, and just the small little differences that you can pick up throughout this, it gives you some insight. Last week was Article 1, Section 8, and the real big changes for that is they've made a huge emphasis on making protective tariffs and federally funded internal improvements. No, they did not want any part of that. I've always theorized, I've always stated that, one of the main reasons the South seceded is because those two things were being thrown at them by the North, and they wanted out. It's economic reasons. So with no further ado.
And I was actually going through my comment section on the show that I did with Mike King. And so many people are, oh yeah, well, this just makes more sense. This is the history that sounds like I've been taught, and so on and so forth. And and that, listen, I have absolute nothing but respect for Mike King. I love that man dearly. I think he's very intelligent. And I don't really believe he has a bias, but I do think that as he stated, he doesn't have a horse in the fight. When his family migrated to the United States post Civil War, or War of Northern Aggression. So I understand where he's coming from, but when you analyze the documents and a lot of the literature from the period and whatnot, the South, or excuse me, the North, really, because we are going to be talking about slavery, and I think this is very important. The North actually was very contemptible about South and Southern life. They didn't understand it. They didn't want to understand it. They had a preconceived notion about it, and the abolitionist movement in the North was very similar to what we would see today with the Black Lives Matter. It was very rabid. And really with no understanding of what the other side was about, other than they wanted to push their agenda.
And they didn't want that other way of life to spill into their region of the country.
That's right. And you have to understand that in the North, when they said that they didn't have any slaves, it wasn't because they were charitable or altruistic towards the Black population. They genuinely did not want the Black population amongst them. So they ended slavery and booted them all down to the South, and or resold them down to the South. And in fact, it was fresh on my brain last night, and now it's escaped because of my lack of sleep. I apologize, but I believe there were 3 states, Illinois, I think it was Oregon or Oregon Territory, and maybe even California Territory, where blacks were outlawed. They couldn't even be in those territories or states.
In the beginning, California was that way, yeah.
Yeah, so we are going to jump into Article 1, Section 9, which is almost verbatim like the U.S. Constitution, but there's going to be a few big differences, and the first one right out of the gate is going to be about slavery. So before we jump into this, anybody here a proponent for bringing back slavery? Anyone? Didn't think so.
Absolutely. There's work I don't want to do around the house. Let's bring back slavery so I don't have to do it.
Wrong.
Yeah, but remember, you got to pay for it. You got to buy those.
Yeah.
You know what? That I want to say something about that, Doug, because you just brought up a very, very interesting point. Everybody talks about slavery was free labor. Bullshit. Slavery was not free labor. People had to pay to buy their slaves, and then they
had to feed them.
They had to feed them. They had to clothe them. They had to house them. They had to do everything. So it was not
healthcare.
Yeah, it was not free labor. Right. I ask you, and I again, I don't use this word lightly. I just use it as a parallel that I think we can understand in our lives. If you have a dog, is your dog free?
Right.
I mean, you have to pay for your dog's food. You have to pay for your all the little toys and trinkets that go with the dog. You have to pay for the veterinary bills. I'm not but in any way insinuating that a black person is the equivalent of a dog. I'm just simply saying that is your property, and that is how slaves were looked upon. So,
you bring up an important point about the economics of slavery, and it's been hypothesized that slavery was eventually going to phase out of the South anyways, because it was an old and broken business model.
Economically, it made no sense. It was cheaper to hire someone than to own somebody.
Yeah, it would have taken decades longer, but at the same time, Lincoln's last proposal for ending slavery would have had slaves still in America as late as the 19 to 18. I think it was the last, would have been the oldest slave to finally be freed. So that was another 60 years he was okay with it. So this is not the black and white issue that it's made out to be by mainstream historians.
Right. Well, and what he wanted to do was he wanted to colonize them. He wanted to round them all up and send them off overseas, kind of like they did with Liberia. And if anybody
well, that's what Liberia was. Liberia was the American colony, and then Sierra Leone was what the British used. And while in the beginning Sierra Leone wasn't working out as well as they would have liked, it wound up in the long run working out really well. And so Liberia, Monrovia being its capital, based on James Monroe. That's exactly what he wanted to do. His attitude was, because he didn't believe that the white and the black could subsist in the same society peacefully, but at the same time wanted to contain slavery, and if it was eventually abolished, and good for those people, but send them to their own society, culture, whatever. And Jefferson actually was interesting when Thomas Jefferson basically said that if there's going to be emancipation, it cannot be instant. If it was instant, there would be animosity between the races. It would need to be a gradual thing to occur. And we saw this rapid emancipation, and sure enough, there's that animosity that rose up pretty much out the gate.
Well, the animosity. Again, the animosity towards the black people really was created more out of a state of fear on the white people in the South than it was, and the, like I said, the rabid abolitionist writings in the North. The Southern states, as I have come to find out, the emancipation movement in the South was much greater than it was in the North, because those people actually lived and saw them every single day. But the depravity and the mistreatment and everything of the black people in the South is what our understanding of it today is much more of a Hollywoodized version of it, as opposed to what really happened.
Well, that was launched by Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she, in her book, characterized the white slave owner as this massive monster, beating, whatever. That's pretty much how the Southern slave owner was portrayed, and it was believed. And that attitude is carried on even beyond the war between the states.
Well, then I think a lot of that is, in that article that I read, and I'll put a link to it. It's from the Abbeville Institute, which is very, very good. And it's the title of the article is "Slavery in the South" or "Slavery in the Southern Constitution," and it gives you gives you an alternate mindset about how the North and the South viewed slaves and viewed people of color. You got to realize that when I get it, but this is actually a really important topic. When they did when the South had the slaves, you got to realize that it was what 3/5 of they made them to be 3/5 of the population to equalize
for the House of Representatives, yeah.
House of Representatives, right? Well, what does that tell you? 3/5 is more than 1/2. So there was more slaves in the South than there were white people. So because obviously,
yet under 5% of free whites owned slaves, but the ones that did, it's like when it comes to Ellison, he owned like thousands of slaves. The Boykins, it was like 300 slaves. So.
All right, that's good background for jumping into this.
I apologize. I don't mean to monopolize.
No. We wanted to get the backstory, but let's get into the Constitution. I'm going to start with the U.S. Constitution on the first part of Article 1, Section 9, because we want to see it so we can see the differences, because they are vastly different. And here we have it. All right. The migration or importation of such persons as of any states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 per person.
Basically, that's the exact same language. We're way past 1808.
Well, yeah.
But what they basically were saying was no Atlantic slave trade. Is basically what they're saying.
And this is the original Constitution. This is written in 1787.
Oh, okay.
And this was so that's why he said it's the exact word. No, I did the U.S. Constitution first because the differences are profound.
Right. Okay. I thought you were reading the Confederate. I didn't read ahead of time, so go ahead.
Yeah, so that's basically what Doug just said. They, we always
get rid of the Atlantic slave trade as of 1808, and after 1808, the number of slaves that were smuggled into the U.S. Illegally were about 13,000. So it was a very small number compared to what it had been, and so it was very successful. The United States used the United States Navy to enforce it.
Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to the Confederate Constitution, dealing with the same subject.
Okay.
And it says, the importation of Negroes of the African race from any foreign country other than the slaveholding states or territories of the United States of America, that's important, is hereby forbidden, and Congress is required to pass such laws as shall effectually prevent the same.
Okay, so once again, not allowing the Atlantic slave trade. The language of such persons to Negroes of the African race. So in other words, they're talking specifically that group when it comes to slavery. In the Constitution, it wasn't only blacks that were slaves. There were white slaves. And that's why they say such persons.
What's interesting to me is they say other than, importation from any foreign country other than the slaveholding states of the territories of the United States of America.
Yeah, in other words, slaves from like Maryland or Kentucky could be bought and transferred into the Confederacy.
Exactly.
But again, it's important to notice that the United States had already outlawed the importation of slaves. So you're actually only drawing from slaves that have been imported to the United States. Their
children.
Or their children, yes.
But they're basically, it's an indication, if you're trying to say that the Confederates, Southern states, they were all about slavery, why would they be stopping the importation?
Well, and the other thing is, if they want a complete separation from the United States and they somehow just hated America, then why did they want to keep that relationship and be willing to make those trades?
I think it's a very good point.
Yeah. Okay, moving on, because it's very much related. Congress shall also have the power to prohibit the introduction of slaves from any state not a member of or territory not belonging to this Confederacy.
So what that does is that just allows the transfer of slaves from Mexico, the Caribbean, the introduction of slaves from any state also that's not a member of the Confederacy, meaning the United States. So
Yeah, I just think those two clauses really shows what their attitude was towards slavery. Look, we're not ready to give up on it, but we're not, just like the
we know it's on its way out.
Yeah. And
well, and I think it's also important to notice that if you look at the writings of the period, the Confederacy actually dreamt of expansion southward into the Caribbean and into Mexico and things and of that nature. They actually were looking for expansion, much like the West, or much like the United States was trying to expand westward. The South had the idea that they were going to expand southward.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting historical footnote. Is there was 5 provinces or states on the Yucatan Peninsula that were looking to join the United States of America. They could not do so because the Missouri Compromise made it so that you had to be a slave state if you were south of the Mason-Dixon line, and of course the Yucatan Peninsula was. Those states were not slaveholders, but they couldn't join the Union as they wanted to. Otherwise, we'd be having a lot more vacations down in South.
Well, you also have to remember that the South was very, very agricultural, and so they're looking for fertile lands. And everything south of southern Missouri, the South Missouri state line, was to the west was, well, desert, West Texas, New Mexico, and so forth. And at that time, they pretty much had realized they weren't going to get the new territories that were starting to emerge. It looks like they were going to become states in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. So they had to look southward because there was no other fertile land to move towards.
Very good point.
100%. And again, not to belabor this point, but the Confederacy was they were I lost my train of thought. My apologies, guys.
All right, you can get it back. All right, these next bits of the Article 9 are going to be verbatim, like the U.S. Constitution. I'm going to go with them really quick. Doug, stop me if you see anything different, but I think it's going to be identical. Section 3, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion of the public safety may require it. Okay. And that is verbatim. Mm-hmm. Section 4, no bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed.
Obviously, the second half is a change, and that's interesting. They wanted to make sure that the Fugitive Slave Act type of laws couldn't be passed.
Yeah. And of course, the original Constitution just says no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed, and they left out the property in Negro slaves.
Property.
Yeah. It's unfortunate. The human beings were considered property in the first place, but
right.
And this is one of the arguments. This is about when you looked at the campaigns of 1860. The fugitive slave law was a very, very hot topic on everyone's minds.
Sure.
And basically, they did not want the northern states to be able to overturn the fugitive slave law or ignore it. And that was a big deal. They wanted the property.
Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, it was extradition for slaves, in the Constitution. And one of the factors that led to the secession was the fact that the northern states were ignoring the Constitution, ignoring the Fugitive Slave Act, which was based on that section, Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution. So they believe that the extradition was not being followed, and the violation and the Constitution was being violated. So they wondered if maybe it wasn't clear enough, and so they wanted to clarify the language to the point where it just could not be violated.
Well, I was going to say that we talked about the South. The secession was caused for economic reasons. Well, this clause right here talking about the property rights of their slaves, that's an economic argument right there. So I think this actually enforces that it wasn't all about slavery. It was more for economic reasons, even though this is about slavery.
It was that, and the fact that the federal government was treating the southern states differently than the other states. They felt they were being singled out, that the Constitution somehow didn't apply to them, but it applied, or didn't apply to the northern states, but applied to them. And when convenient kind of thing. That sounds familiar. So it was an anger because wait a second, rule of law. What the rule? The rule of law is something that can be decided upon based on the situation. And they didn't like that type of fluid thinking when it came to the Constitution, when it came to the rule of law, when it came to the treatment of them. They were being treated like outsiders already. So why stay a part of the Union?
Brady, you and I, after my show that I did with Mike, you and I did we had a quick phone conversation about how North had essentially positioned itself as an intermediary between the southern states and Europe in terms of like a broker of the cotton, and then on the tariff money that was coming back from Europe that would ultimately be sold back into the states. Can you, because I think that's a very important part that a lot of people really don't understand, and it kind of, and again, this is I'm not doing this as an attack on Mike, but I think that the way you explained it to me actually resonated much more clear than anything I've ever heard. Can you touch on that real quick?
Well, whether or not I can hit that language exactly right, I don't know. But when it came to, you got to remember that there was influence. Europe was influential. They wanted to see the United States divided. A divided America was good for them because a united America was fairly strong, first of all. Second of all, they knew they would get their goods cheaper dealing directly with the South and either manufacturing the products themselves or the South beginning to manufacture. And so there was influence. I don't remember our entire conversation, but that was kind of the crux of it. And we have to remember that the North was completely actually dependent upon the South because the raw materials weren't coming from the North. All the industry was in the North, but the raw
materials. You have to understand what cotton was. Back then, cotton was, today we have oil.
Back then, it was the number one product in the world.
The cotton was oil back then. I mean, it was the equivalent of our oil today.
Right.
But if I said Doug, I apologize. I meant Brady because Brady actually gave.
Well, we both had a conversation, I guess. Then afterwards,
right? We did. My conversation with you was immediately after, but Brady put it very succinctly in a way that was like in pieces that I could understand, and I just wanted him to give that brief. Like I think it was like 2 or 3 minutes of dialogue that he gave me.
Yeah, I heard Brady the first time too. I think Doug heard Doug. It's no big deal. He gave it.
I didn't hear any name, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, what I was talking about with Ron is when you lay a protective tariff, it's basically a tax on your own exporters. And what I mean by that is the Europeans are sending goods to the North and they're getting a tariff put on them. Because of that, the Europeans have less money available to purchase the goods coming from the South, who are exporters. The North are importers, South is exporters, and Europe is both. Basically, the North is indirectly taxing the South by putting a tariff on Europe because they have less money to buy Southern goods. It's that economic circle that was, they fought over this for 4 decades. And that's why protective tariffs are so damaging, or can be, if it's not done correctly.
Because the goods that were being sold by the United States were being tariffed in Europe because of the tariffs, because they had tariffs, and then when they sold them back to the United States out of the raw materials that they were using from the South was the one that was really spending the most amount of money.
Yeah, it really comes down. It's even more than that. By putting tariffs on Europe, Europeans have less money to buy Southern goods. Therefore, the South's sales go down, and that's really, it basically kills the economic circle by putting those tariffs up. Favors one of the 3 trading partners, and the other 2 have to pay the price.
Right, and so a divided America dealing directly with the South, tariff goes away. The South is happy as the price goes up. The Europe is happy because it doesn't go up as much as it could have with the tariffs. It only goes up slightly, and it actually goes down for them because they're dealing directly with the raw material producer.
Yeah, and the tax base, the fact that the South represents such a big part of the tax base matters if we go back to internal improvements. The North was getting ready to industrialize, build transcontinental railroads, all that. They wanted government subsidies to do that, and the government needed the tax base. So when the South secedes, takes away more than, I think it was more than half the tax base, the North all of a sudden can't do their projects. That's a pretty darn good reason to invade. All right, moving on.
And I don't mean to belabor that point, but if I remember correctly, what the South wanted to do was they wanted to open up their ports to the European traders, and instead of charging a 40% or a 50% tariff, what they wanted to do was charge 10%. They're like, hey, if 10% is good enough for the Bible, it's good enough for us.
Yeah, once again, the South would be getting an increase in revenue, but the Europe would be paying less when it comes to the products by cutting the North out of the picture.
Yeah, so Europeans had every incentive to have America split.
Hmm.
I mean, they absolutely. There's people out there that have different theories about this. Matt Ehret's one of them. He basically thinks the Europeans caused the South to succeed. They were whispering in their ears, and there's some truth to that. The Europeans had every incentive to split the North from the South. It would have made a weaker America. England has never stopped wanting their "quote unquote" crown jewel back. No, they haven't. This was written about by I just drew a blank on his name.
De Lorenzo?
No. I come back to this. It's a name I say all the time. I can't believe I just drew a blank. Who's the Rothschilds agent who started all the colonies in Africa? My God, how do I draw a blank on this guy's name? Rhodes, Cecil B. Rhodes, wrote about it in the 1860s. It would have been 60s or 70s. About he was the ultimate Anglo supremacist, and he openly wrote about reuniting England with their crown jewel, the United States of America. He was very influential in British politics. So this was definitely on the radar. The Europeans wanted America split, and England wanted it back. So that's definitely in play.
And whenever you hear the word Anglo, think England.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Not you, but you'd be surprised at how many people, when I say Anglo-American, they were like, what are you talking about? Anglo essentially is it's a fancy word for saying the English relationship with the United States or America.
What's kind of hilarious about that is the Anglos actually primarily settled more towards Scotland, and in England it was more the Saxons, but that's beside the point. Go ahead.
All right, moving on. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration hereinbefore directed to be taken.
Completely identical. And the capitation would be a direct taxation, a head tax, an individual tax. It was basically saying that the central government could not tax anybody directly. It had to do with the census. The states were basically paying part of the budget rather than individual persons being directly taxed.
Section 6. Here's a subtle difference. No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state, which is how the U.S. Constitution writes. And then they add in, except by a vote of 2/3 of both houses. Now, that is new.
And I'm guessing, and I don't know this for sure, but based on what I know about the relationship, I'm guessing this was regarding state to state transfer of goods with states that were still in the United States.
I am not sure what the argument behind this was. I'll have to give it back to you when we do the next show, because it's obviously in the book that I have over there. But I'm going to.
They may not be illustrating it explicitly, but I think if you go back up into the outset of this section, they talk specifically about the states, the northern states and the states of the United States and the territories of the United States. So I think it could be innuendo that what they're still directing it towards that, because this is a section of that.
Okay, I think you'll find section 7 is going to be pretty interesting. I'll read the Confederate version first. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's uniformity when it comes to the ports.
Yeah. With the U.S. Constitution, It's a bit longer. It says no preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another. Nor shall, here's where they had the additional, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. Now that was stricken.
Well, you got to remember when it came to the colonies that became states, they operated as their own countries. They had fees and import and you had to pay a fee for your ship to come into port and all sort of stuff. They acted as if they were their own country. And under the Constitution, with it being a union, that authority is going to be going to the federal government, and there would be no fees between the states because they're now part of the union. The Confederate states really didn't have that same dynamic. The states really didn't operate as their own countries in the same manner, so it was not necessary to be in this clause.
Yeah. Are you 100% sure about that? Because I think the southern states, I think the mindset was fairly similar.
No, I'm not saying that they're doing away with the sovereignty or autonomy. It's just that they didn't have that same history.
Oh, okay, but because I mean because the mentality up until this point was basically the same as it was in colonial America, that these states themselves were their own individual sovereign countries. And
yeah, but they hadn't operated in that manner,
right?
So there's that difference.
But that was still there. That was still their intent.
Mm-hmm.
The thing I wanted to point out is, obviously, this is Article 1, which is addressing Congress, and it's basically saying Congress cannot make any kind of regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one another. It is not telling. It's not telling what the states would do. It's saying everyone is treated equally by Congress. They cannot favor one over the other.
Right.
And there's an important part of that, because obviously before secession, Congress was making laws that were favoring northern states over the South, and so they really. And there's the reason this one was kept in there verbatim, or that part of it verbatim. Continuing on. No money shall be drawn from the treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement accounts of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time.
Word for word. And that last part being the same in both constitutions is a reminder that it is the federal government is tasked with transparency and letting the public know how all of the dollars are spent. Not that would tie in anything going on today.
Okay, sections 9 and 10 are brand new. They do not exist in the U.S. Constitution. So obviously they saw something over 80 years of experience in the U.S. Constitution that needed a little bit more elaboration. So we're going to go through this a little bit slowly. Congress shall appropriate no money from the Treasury except by a vote of 2/3 of both houses, taken by yeas and nays, unless it be asked and estimated for by some of the heads of departments and submitted to Congress by the President. Stop right there. They're talking about appropriation of money.
Where money's to be spent.
Yeah. So what do they see of those previous 80 years that made this necessary to put in there? Was
money's being spent unconstitutionally very easily by the majority party.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the North that was guilty of that. Remember, I've talked about how corrupt these Southern Democrats were leading up to secession. There were no angels.
Mm-hmm.
They continue, or for the purpose of paying its own expenses and contingencies. Congress can't, appropriate money, or for the payment of claims against the Confederate States, the justice of which shall have been judicially declared by a tribunal for the investigation of claims against the government, which it is hereby made the duty of Congress to establish.
Well, talk about indicating that they believe there's crimes against the southern states by the North.
Yeah, that really lays it out right there, doesn't it? You want to elaborate on that a bit, Doug? I think it's an important point.
In what way?
Well, exactly what was going on, what was the injustice they were seeing, and why did they feel necessary to enshrine this into their Constitution?
Well, I mean, A lot of that goes back to the railroads. A lot of that goes back to what was going on with public monies and how they were being spent, and being spent in an unconstitutional manner on things that, and basically whoever basically what was going on is whichever party was in power got what they wanted with a simple majority. When you ask for a supermajority like 2/3 or 3/4, what you're saying is there needs to be a bipartisan approval. And what this did is this disallowed the any faction from easily getting money spent the way it wanted to. Ultimately, that's what it means. Now that said,
basically you need a supermajority almost. You need a supermajority to get something like this passed. That's how that's how they were. That was their mindset. They didn't want to just make it just a simple partisan issue. So if like democracy, the United States does participate in democracy twice a year. It's called election day.
well, and then when it comes to this last part that he highlighted, the payment of claims against Confederate states, the justice of which shall be judicially declared by a tribunal for the investigation of claims against the government. For lack of a better way of saying it, the northern states and northern entities and the big money were using, for lack of a better way of saying it, lawfare against Confederate states and making claims. And they're saying, hey, we're gonna make sure we're not just gonna pay it out. We're gonna make sure it needs to be investigated, and our Congress is in charge of being involved in that process.
Very good.
No, you mean lawfare existed back then too?
Yeah.
Well, you're going to love this next section 10 because it does not exist in the U.S. Constitution, but boy, do I sure wish it would. We should just copy this one verbatim and make an amendment. All bills appropriating money shall specify in federal currency the exact amount of each appropriation and the purposes for which it is made.
Line item appropriations.
We would not need a Department of Government Efficiency if we had this as part of the U.S. Constitution.
Now, I'm curious why they used federal.
Because it's a confederacy.
Well, it's a Confederate government, but they were calling it a federal government.
Yeah, it's a federal system.
It's
as opposed to
confederal system.
Yeah,
but
it was a confederacy of states, not a federacy of states. But I understand.
Yeah, that struck me as a little bit weird.
So here's a beautiful one. The second part. And Congress shall grant no extra compensation to any public contractor, officer, agent, or servant after such contract shall have been made or such service rendered. This entire section is against crony capitalism and basically putting all those extra bills and
collusion. Yeah.
I mean, this obviously this stuff was going on prior to secession. Mm-hmm. They thought it was a big deal. We think the government is corrupt. This is basically the anti-internal improvement crony capitalism clause. And I would have no problem if verbatim this went into the U.S. Constitution as the 28th Amendment.
And if people are surprised that this was going on, that it sounds similar to what we see today, remember what King Solomon said: there's nothing new under the sun.
Well, you mean human nature is consistent?
Exactly. But to your point, this is that the guys in the South saw that the money that they were spending in all this tariff money was going up to the northern government, which basically had, at that point in time, even though at the outset it was supposed to be balanced, the power of the power of the federalism in DC had overtaken the balance of power. And that's one of the primary reasons that they said, heck no, we're done, we're out. And by incorporating this into their constitution, this was their defensive mechanism against having that happen in their new country.
Yeah, because human nature isn't going to change. It would have happened. It would have happened again if you didn't prohibit it. I really do.
I'm with you. I think that this would be a fantastic 28th Amendment.
Section 11 is verbatim. No title of nobility shall be granted by Confederate states, no person holding any office of profit, blah, blah, blah. And this is titles of nobility. It is word for word the exact same as in the U.S. Constitution.
Well, not only titles of nobility, but also gifts from foreign countries, kings and potentates and all that. They did not want interference or any intrusion by foreign powers into their system. And once again, it runs in line with what the founders wanted. In the case of the founders, they feared not only European influence, but through the Tories. The South had their own version of Tories, in a sense, people who didn't like the separation from the Union and so on and so forth. And they wanted to make sure that those agents weren't working with the European countries and bringing, and for the Europe to exercise influence through presence or something like that. It's just protection.
Okay, so they start to deviate from the structure of the U.S. Constitution here. The U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, ends with titles of nobility. The Confederate Constitution adds a bunch more, and we're going to go through those right now. And some of the stuff you'll see, the language will appear in things like the amendments.
Well, this is, in a sense, their Bill of Rights, because they're not going to add their Bill of Rights later. They wanted it out the gate.
Yeah, which is actually pretty interesting historically if you look at the history of the Bill of Rights. Remember, Madison thought the Bill of Rights was redundant.
Well, and also remember that one of the reasons why the colonists, the politicians that day were demanding a Bill of Rights is they had a Bill of Rights under Britain, and they believed that it had worked advantageously for them. And
it may have, because you're talking about you're being ruled by a monarch as opposed to a constitutional republic where it's probably not as necessary. Plus, what they had something called the enumeration doctrine, which already said, if we didn't tell you you can do it, you can't do it. We don't need to tell you can't do it again.
Right.
This is their version. They enumerate it here. So Congress shall make, this is the First Amendment, basically. Is it word for word? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or to notice assembly and petition. This is verbatim the First Amendment, is it not?
Yes.
This would be the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That would be verbatim. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner prescribed by law.
Word for word.
So they didn't organize their constitution in the same with like amendment and whatever. This is actually put.
Yeah, it's the Bill of Rights, but because they're not going to add them later, they wanted to include them in the original Constitution. Added them to Article 1.
Yep. Do we want to go through all of these? Just glancing at it, looks like they got all 10 verbatim.
Mm-hmm.
Excessive bail. We're down here. You're not going to have a 9th or 10th Amendment, are you? Let's look at 18. Is 18 identical, Doug? In suits of common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact so tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the Confederacy than according to rules of common law.
Yeah, it's pretty much along with the 7th Amendment, and then 19 is right along with the 8th Amendment.
Okay, but there is no 9th.
But I don't see a 9th or 10th.
There is no 9th or 10th. And you don't need the 10th because they enumerated the Bill of Rights. Now, this kind of leads into an interesting question. About incorporation. I don't think we want to go down that rabbit hole, but think about that. Let's think of the implications of that. If we started into incorporation, that's a whole other rabbit trail. But it's a little bit different argument. 20.
20 is beautiful. It's beautiful. Go ahead.
Let me ask something real quick. By putting it into the Constitution like this and not making it an actual amendment, does it not make it easier for it to be legislatively altered?
No, No, it's whether something is added by amendment or it's a part of the original articles, it still has the same constitutional force.
Okay,
Yeah,
so the amendments then are things that can be changed.
No. The amendments are no different than the first articles. They're just added to the Constitution.
I'm talking about the United States Constitution.
Right. I understand that. And
right.
Those amendments, whether it's the first 7 articles or the amendments, that what's in the first 7 articles will be changed by amendment, no different than an amendment can be.
Agreed.
All right, I'm not trying to go down a rabbit hole. I'm just I'm just trying to clarify here because
people have a tendency of wanting to say that the Bill of Rights is different from the Constitution. It's a different document or something. It is the Constitution. It's part of the Constitution. Amendments are no different than the original 7 articles once they are ratified. They are just as much in force as the first 7 articles.
Yeah, it's
and the changeability is the same.
If you build a house and then put an extension, it's still part of the house. Still your property, same. That's best analogy I can come up with.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. And Section 20 here is interesting because they were having the same problem we have today, earmarks and laws or bills not standing on their own. Omnibus bills, things like that. So go ahead.
Every law or resolution having the force of law shall relate to but one subject, and that shall be expressed in the title. Boy, wouldn't that be nice?
I love that. That should be an amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
You mean the Patriot Act that does nothing of the sort, or the the Inflation Reduction Act that did nothing about inflation? That wouldn't happen. And the single subject bill.
The Affordable Care Act, it made it really affordable.
It's just not the name, but the fact that everything needs to stand on its own. And what you see, of course, in politics today is, hey, if we can get your vote for this, we'll add an earmark for this other thing. Well, this says no. That wheeling and dealing is not going to happen. No earmarks. The bill is going to stand on its own. There's nothing to be added. No multiple subjects. No earmarks. And so what that does is it eliminates the ability to buy someone's vote, to trade on the floor, basically, of Congress.
Well,
because you've heard me say there's more trading on the floor of Congress than there is in Wall Street.
And that's really how you get the pork out of the system, and you get a lot more. You force politicians to be much more honest. It's a big deal, and it's a darn shame the U.S. Constitution doesn't have that. Now, what's interesting is we've seen a lot of people more recently suggest single subject bills, and so that's in play. And I think it's something.
And about 10 years ago, actually about 14 years ago, they actually did pass a law calling for that, but then they played other games behind the curtain. What it did is, since the bill couldn't have multiple subjects, they would hide it. In other words, the earmark wouldn't be officially a part of a bill, but it would be a wink, wink, nod, nod. You're going to get this if you give us our vote. So give us your vote. So it's sometimes because of the corruption, it's hard to ensure that this is followed by the letter.
Yeah. So I was going to say. So what you're saying is that men are corrupt. Period. Basically.
Yeah, it means our politicians need rules to make sure they can't be corrupted, and they still find ways around it. And
but this is a good one. I like this one. I think the founding fathers would have been proud and may have, if they had thought of it, put it in themselves.
Yeah, well, obviously, they felt a need for it. So what was going on the prior 80 years is exactly what we're, continuation of what we're seeing today. So, all right, we get to Section 10. This is going to be, I think, word for word verbatim what the U.S. Constitution has as Section 10.
Notice there's no Article 1, Section 9.
Well, we are in Article 1, Section 9.
Well, I mean, it's not exactly the same. This is the way it's structured is very different from the Constitution in that sense. But Article 1, Section 10, it's almost not only language, but structure everything, is my point.
Yeah, the difference is that the deviation really is just throwing the Bill of Rights in Article 1, Section 9. Besides that, they're still following the same structure.
Right.
Why not? It was pretty good structure.
Yeah, I mean, the paragraphing, everything, it's exactly the same.
Yeah. So basically, just give us a summary. Section 10, Part 1, no state shall enter treaties and alliances, talk about ex post facto laws, and also, once again, titles of nobility. Verbatim, what the U.S. Constitution says.
And this is basically saying, hey, you know, when it comes to the external issues, states don't get involved. This is up to the central government.
Section 2, of course, is imposts and duties on imports and exports. Once again, identical with the U.S. Constitution. Separate says Confederate States.
Yeah, name of the country is the only difference. Yeah.
Yep. And Section 3 will be the same thing. Duties on tonnage, seagoing vessels, etc.
Well, actually, that's interesting because the except on seagoing vessels is an addition. So no state shall without the consent of Congress lay any duty on tonnage. That except on seagoing vessels for the improvement of its rivers and harbors navigated by said vessels. That's new.
Probably had a lot to do with the Mississippi River
and the canals that they were building all over the place to. I didn't know this until recently. I used to think that rail was the biggest way that things got transported within the central portion of the United States. Boy, was I wrong.
Canals for a while was the big ticket.
Well, it still is to this day. Barges pushed by boats on the river and through canals actually make up almost 3 times the amount, if I remember the numbers correctly, 3 times the amount of cargo that is shipped within the United States. So I was flabbergasted by that.
Here's a very interesting part at the very end here. This is new. But when any river divides or flows through 2 or more states, they may enter into compacts with each other to improve the navigation thereof.
And what that's doing is saying it's not a federal issue; it's between the states. See, in today's world, if the waterway is navigable, then the federal government automatically claims authority.
But Doug, how are you going to have interstate highways if the federal government doesn't do it?
Exactly.
I think a very good example of this would be the Columbia River. The Columbia River, I had no idea about this until recently, that there is a main seaport in Idaho, and and I forget the name of the town, but if you take the Columbia River and you follow it all the way, which obviously is the land of incidentally, they were, before they named Washington, it was actually going to be named Columbia, but they changed it to Washington. So they're brilliant. Anyway, the Columbia River flows is essentially the borderline of Oregon and Washington up until about like 2/3 of the way, and then it migrates up in through Washington and into Idaho, and from there. There's a major port where all the rail brings the grain and whatnot, and it gets put on barges. I didn't know that.
Well, when I was in the Navy, we actually ported in Portland on the Columbia. People don't realize how big the Columbia River is, and if you go up the Columbia River, and I just drove down along the Columbia last November, and there actually is almost like there's a canal type system in a couple of places along the river that I saw, where they have the locks and the whole bit. It was very interesting.
What's neat about it, right around that part that Ron's describing, right before it turns, it's called the Columbia River Gorge, and it is massive river and these deep canyon walls. It's so windy in there. It's one of the best windsurfing places sites in the world. I mean, it is a really big deal. I have a cousin who actually has a house overlooking the gorge, and it's a beautiful view.
Yeah, and if you're in the eastern part of Oregon along the Columbia River, there is actually a bunch of a state park, national park. I don't remember which. I think it's a state park where it's the Columbia Gorge, and they've got a museum and the whole bit, and it's very interesting reading. Definitely worth visiting. Once again, last November we were there.
All right, we've got time to probably jump into Article 2, and I'm going to go relatively quickly. And Article 2 talks about what? The executive branch. And Doug, just stop me if you see anything different. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the Confederate States of America. He and the vice president shall hold their office for the term of 6 years.
Stop. 6 years?
Mm-hmm.
A little bit longer presidency. Now, one of the things that you saw the founders do is they staggered everything. You have 2 years for the House, 4 years for the president, 6 years for the Senate. And so while I understand they wanted the president for whatever reason to hold his term longer, what it did is it opened up the threat that a third of the Senate could be collusive with the president because their terms matched. All right, continue.
Yeah, and it's really this next little short bit is why, but the president shall not be re-eligible.
Right, cannot run for re-election.
You get one term, 4 years is not enough. We'll give you 6.
But that's all you get. So there's no, 6 is the max.
Yeah, there's a lot of reason for doing that. Talking about a lame duck president from day one, what have you. You also don't, you want a president to be making the best decisions for the nation, not the best decisions based on your own reelection. There's conflicts of interest they're trying to avoid. The reason they actually put this in the Constitution is they had seen evidence of an issue with presidents worrying about their reelection more than doing their job.
Well, and that's a part of the political game. Steve Stockman, who was the Congress critter in Texas that replaced Ron Paul after Ron Paul had retired, had told me in a conversation that 2/3 of your time in the House is preparing for re-election, and that's very, very telling. President, same thing. When does the election season start? Before he's halfway through with his term.
It's all these people calling for the constitutional amendment for term limits, and there's pros and cons to that. The Confederate Constitution thought it was a good idea, at least for the presidency.
Yeah, well, and for executives, term limits are a good idea. Legislatively, we saw in California, it's been a disaster. Term limits are a bad idea when it comes to legislators, especially when you have a deep state that's as infiltrated as it is.
Yeah, you got that. I think it's important to talk about why term limits are bad. It's not necessarily the Congress critters that are bad, but it is the staff that sticks around,
the bureaucracy,
and it's the bureaucracy behind it. And
a lot of times, we're seeing that with President Trump. The bureaucracy believes it's in charge. The bureaucracy is more important than the president. They're the ones that run the executive branch. We had a judge just say so a couple of days ago.
Yeah, and to add to Ron's point, the other issue is, if you give term limits to a crooked, senator or congressman, they only have 2 years or 6 years, whatever amount to get their corruption done. They're just going to work a lot faster and be more brazen. They know how much money they need to get out of that career. All right, continuing on, the president and vice president shall be elected as follows. This is interesting. Each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. Is that verbatim the same?
Yes, that's Electoral College verbatim.
But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the Confederate States shall be appointed an elector.
Same thing. It's identical.
Okay.
And it's basically the foundation of the Electoral College. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Constitution of the Electoral College, the electors voted for president. There was not a vote of the people, and the electors matched that vote as we see today. The electors were chosen, then they voted for president. And typically, the way they were chosen was the people would vote for an elector to represent them that was in place because of the number of House representatives. So in other words, you would basically vote for an elector to represent your congressional district. The other two electors, which are there because of the Senate, one would belong to each house of the state legislature, and they would appoint those electors. And then those electors are the ones voting for president. What it did is it gave indirect democracy to the people, and it gave the states also a hand in the election of the president.
Now, so what you're saying is that there is the way that it should be then, or the way that it was then, and the way that it should be now, and the way that it was illustrated here, it says there were essentially two elections. You would elect a representative to go vote for the president on your behalf, and then that person would then go and vote. Now, was at this time, forgive me because I don't know, was the state winner take all?
In the beginning, it wasn't. Now, at the time of the war between the states, it was winner take all for pretty much all of them except for South Carolina right before the war. South Carolina had stuck to the old way of doing it. And then, as you can see here, the southern states wanted to go back to the old way. They saw the folly of what was happening. The change in Electoral College had been pushed by Andrew Jackson, who believed in pure democracy, and he wanted the people's vote to be more involved with the election of the president.
Yeah, and you can see that the Confederacy wanted to go back to the original Constitution. They recognized that it works, and I've long been on record saying I'd like to see an expanded Electoral College. It has to do with how big the population is and everything like that. I think we could all find neighborhood electors and to go representatives, and you'd also have we'd also get a different kind of politician if we did that expanded Electoral College. Because right now it's who raises the most money, can do the most advertising, is going to get the most votes. And I don't want to, that's not the criteria for who we want to be in office. We want people that can actually sit there and convince the people that each neighborhood or county, whatever, represent and say, I make my argument to the smartest people from each neighborhood. To me, you get a totally different politician than somebody who can actually make the argument, this is why you should elect me, as opposed to I raise more money, I win. So there is some. That's my big argument for an expanded Electoral College.
So just for the record, for those of you on the left who think that people on the right are not for we don't want a majority vote. We don't want the popular vote to be the arbiter of who wins the presidency. We do want a reformation from the standpoint that the electors are free to choose who they want to be. So we do also, because I feel the same, because if California was allowed to have the congressional district represent the 58,
it wasn't winner take all.
It wasn't winner take all. A lot of California votes would have gone to Trump.
Right. Well, and what it does by it not being winner take all, and by the electors being chosen the way they are, and what it does is it ensures that the states that are not heavily populated also have a voice. Without using those mechanisms, the larger, heavily populated states will dominate everything, and the other states are just along for the ride. And this gives those smaller states a voice.
Kind of like what we have now, sort of.
Yeah, sort of. Well, and I tell people all the time, democracy is our problem. It's, for example, because I'm in Oregon now, and basically this state is blue because of Portland and the surrounding regions. This state is actually a very conservative state. If we didn't have pure democracy in both houses, we went back to the old way, and this is the old Reynolds v. Sims discussion, where the state senate was one per county. You would have a rural-minded state senate. You would then have a city-minded assembly or state house, and now you have discussion. Now you have debate rather than just one party running away with everything, and that was the reason they did it that way.
For those who have not seen all of my channel, Doug and I do a pretty lengthy, in-depth discussion about Reynolds v. Sims and all of these issues, the rural versus city. So if you go back on my timeline, look for the two videos, one on the 17th Amendment and the other one on Reynolds v. Sims. Those are both part of the Re-Federalist report series, which is what this video is under. So go take a look at that. And, we go into a lot of detail on that. And there's good arguments to be made for, overturning Reynolds v. Sims. In fact, someone asked me, it was Elon Musk on X the other day, just put out there, if you were president of the United States, you could do one thing. What was the thing you do on day one? I would direct my DOJ to sue to overturn Reynolds v. Sims. That would be my very first thing to do.
You wouldn't. Do you think that's more important than overturning the 17th Amendment?
Yeah,
it would lead to the overturning of the 17th Amendment.
Yep.
Okay.
So what would happen immediately is California would have probably 53 Republican counties, and they'd have 53 people in the state Senate and 7 or whatever handful of Democrats. So now you're going to have a very conservative Senate in California. You're going to have still going to have Democrats going to dominate the population-based House, and they're going to be forced to compromise, maybe get better voting laws, et cetera, et cetera. It'll be the most powerful, quickest fix to a lot of these. What's one of the big issues is a lot of these states. You look at Illinois, you got blue Chicago and red everywhere else. Oregon, you got blue Portland, red everywhere else. Same thing with Washington. This eliminates that. And the founding fathers knew this was going to be a problem. You have to protect the rural from the cities and vice versa. So they put a balance, and Reynolds v. Sims got rid of that balance. So it's almost like Hunger Games. We're all ruled by the cities, and we've got to get rid of that.
Much, yeah.
To your point there, the 17th Amendment started that. And then, well, I mean, it was started before that, but the 17th Amendment were kind of like put it in wet cement, and then Reynolds v. Sims, basically, that was when the cement had cured. It was basically giving all the power to the concentration of population areas, and that was, and again, that was expressly, if you listen to if you read the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, that was expressly what they were trying to avoid. And I think it's important. I did a show a week ago on neuro-linguistic programming. Not that these guys were doing that back then, but in modern days, do you remember what the slogan for that Woodrow Wilson used to like rally us to go to war in Europe? Do you remember what the slogan was used? It was to make the world safe for democracy. So this whole democracy thing has been something that has been implanted in us for almost a century.
It goes back further than that. 5 times in the Federalist Papers, Madison found it necessary to explain the difference between a democracy and a republic, because already there were those out there arguing that there was no difference between a democracy and a republic, because they understood that democracy is a transitional system towards oligarchy or bigger government. Also in Federalist 10, Madison spends a lot of time talking about factions, and that there's always going to be factions that trying to dominate. And the best way to control the factions is not to eliminate them, but to set them against each other. But in order to do that, you have to give the smaller factions a bigger boost of voice, which gets us back to what we're talking about.
I'm going to ask you to, and I'm not trying to go down this rabbit hole but this is actually really, really important. When, to your knowledge, when was the first time that the term democracy was used as a towards the public, to get that ingrained into the public? Because I couldn't find it after I've had a difficult time finding anything since before Woodrow Wilson in terms of like pushing it out to the public. You
would have found it started to get more and more common during Andrew Jackson. He spoke. He used the language quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, democracy was being thrown around a little bit, as early as 1791. But once Jackson came into place, because he believed that democracy was the best way to make sure that the quote unquote Constitution was maintained for the people, consent to the governed, and so on and so forth. And when I talk about the dangers of democracy, I'm not saying that people should have no voice. I'm saying that voice should not be completely by the vote. When you put too much power into any place's hands, it becomes dangerous, and that includes our own hands. Should we have some democratic vote? Absolutely. That's why they established the House of Representatives the way they did. But to give Americans the power across the board with democracy, it's just like giving the president too much power or Congress too much power. It's abused, and they dominate the system. You want to distribute power in such a way that it's basically creates a balance. And that includes our power.
Well said. And it's interesting that the framers of the Confederate Constitution absolutely understood that. And you see that the language they keep in their document from the U.S. Constitution absolutely emphasizes that. And they even add a little bit more of their own, as we saw on the term limits. So they understood these things. They've seen the abuses. They agreed with it in spirit. And this document is in no way, shape, or form establishes democracy. In fact, it probably is a little bit closer to a pure republic, creating a Republican form of government than the U.S. Constitution even is.
And for clarification, we do have democracy in this country. It's called your city. It's called your city council. It's called your board of supervisors. It's called your legislatures. It's called
the House of Representatives, but the Senate wasn't.
Right. Well, but the point of the matter is that we do have democracy, and we participate in a democratic system. Like I said before, when we vote, whether it be twice a year or 4 times a year if there's primaries. So we do participate in the system, but our participation is limited to those 3 or 4
Right.
times a year.
Yeah, well, there are elements of democracy in the system, but it works together with the other elements to create a federal republic. We're not a democracy, we're a federal republic, and while there is democracy, it is blended with the other methods so that it works or is supposed to work properly.
I like to say, instead of blended, like say it's balanced with the other portions.
Well, and it creates balance, absolutely, and that's the point.
When you
Distribution
start,
of powers.
when you start blending it, the democracy part's going to keep creeping, as we've seen happen over the last century here.
Well, the thing that drives me crazy is that most people, we're not a democracy, but they don't really know what that means. And I think this is a perfect illustration as to what the differences are. And so anyway, that was why.
Right, well, let's see. Now that's a great opportunity for me to do a selfish plug. So I actually wrote a book about that. It's called Repeal Democracy. And I go chapter by chapter, and I begin each chapter, if we were democracy, and then I explain the way we would be doing it if we were democracy, and then why we do it a different way on each item. And I go through, I think it's like a dozen different parts of our system in order to explain it in the book. So.
Well, it was actually a really good time to give your plug, because I was going to say this is a good point to wrap up for today. We got a late start, so let's go ahead and stop where we are. Doug, you want to finish giving yourself a plug?
Yeah. So aside from finding Repeal Democracy by Douglas V. Gibbs at Amazon at the moment, elsewhere later, DouglasVGibbs.com. I've started making videos again, and I'm getting pretty consistent. As a matter of fact, I'm editing one right now that should be out today. That gets into the president versus the federal courts. Do the federal courts have the authority to demand that he ask their permission to do something within his branch? I get into all that. But here's the nice part about it. Everything I do, social media, my website, videos, all you have to remember is Douglas V. Gibbs, my name. YouTube.com/Douglas V. Gibbs. Rumble.com/Douglas V. Gibbs. Facebook.com/Douglas V. Whatever it is, just remember my name, Douglas V. Gibbs, and you'll get there, including DouglasVGibbs.com. And also, I do have 2 radio programs. I'm on 3 radio stations in Southern California. Constitution Radio on KMET 1490 AM, KMET 1490 AM.com on Saturdays from 1 to 3 Pacific, and then at 8 o'clock on The Answer San Diego, KCBQ, or K-Praise, KPRZ. At 9 o'clock, that's getting ready to move to 8 o'clock, like KCBQ. I'm also on that. But the great thing about that show, Mr. Constitution Hour, is it's also on all the podcast channels. And once again, that keyword is Douglas V. Gibbs. And in that case, when you're searching for my shows on podcast, Mr. Constitution Hour by Douglas V. Gibbs.
Ron, where can we find you?
Oh, that's going to be very difficult if you don't know how to type. It's called untoldhistory.tv.
Because your voice got muffled there. He said untoldhistory.tv.
Yeah, untold, 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 untoldhistory.tv. Takes you directly to my Rumble channel, and I'm actually working on a store right now, so to have like some cool quotes and things on T-shirts and things of that nature. So that's coming.
And once a week, I'm on that channel too.
Yes, you are. And if I could get Warhamster to get off his ass and find some more time, maybe 25 or 6 hours in a day, then I might be able to get him on my channel a little bit more, because a lot of the topics that he talks about from a Re-Federalist standpoint, that is absolutely untold history, and I would love to have him on more to go through a lot of those things, because you two are both just an absolute wealth of knowledge. So, and not having you on my channel is it's cardinal sin.
Yeah, I appreciate the kind words, and I would be on more often. It's just the East Coast time zone difference for me. Once most of your shows are in the evening, and I'm with my new wife, and she does require my attention. So I every once in a while I get a permission slip. So if you give me advance notice, I will try to make it.
Well, just FYI, I'm not married to that time slot. That's just when I go. But if you guys have the time and interest, I would love to do something like what you did with, with the Re-Federalist stuff, even starting going back to the beginning, because you've already talked about it. And we three discussed it going back and just kind of, as a new one, but just do it on my channel as opposed to something that you're going to be uploading there, because I know that you guys just talking about it in the past will make you even sharper talking about it in the future. So, because I tell you what, the response that I'm getting on the going through the federal constitution versus the Confederate Constitution is very positive. People are like, wow, I had no idea. Nobody's ever taught me this.
Yeah, they're really enjoying the show. Well, you see the chat room too, where people are like, wow, I just love this show. I love being here every week. So,
all right, gentlemen, thanks again for being here. Not sure when we're going to reconvene. I take off in a couple of days for a trip to the Caribbean, and I will be gone for about a week. But maybe the Friday after, 2 Fridays from now, I'll be back. But I'll be in touch when I land, and we'll see if we can get.
I'll be in Florida this coming weekend, so I'll be back until Monday. I'll be back a week from today.
All right, everybody. Until the next time. Cheers.